Thank you very much indeed, Frederik. There is so much ambition in the room, and also incredibly inspiring to see the timeline, to see his confidence and his ambition moving forward. So we are just getting started. And the truth is that the opportunity is so great, we must take a few moments to reflect on exactly what is at stake. And in order to make sure that we delve deep and look underneath the surface, we'll shortly welcome Frederik back to join a panel including Massimo Morini from Algorand Foundation, the chief economist there, and Inbar Preiss from The Block. And in this panel, we will truly try and understand exactly what is at stake. We will explore the regulatory landscape and what it means practically for us each and every day. We'll start to examine the incentive models and the rules and the roles that they will play as we move into the future. Of course, we'll talk about governance and explore interoperability and many more. Please join me in welcoming back to the stage Frederik with Massimo and Inbar Preiss.
Thank you. Hi, and welcome to the very first panel that we have over here. My name is Inbar. I'm a reporter for The Block. I cover policy, and it's really great to be able to host this panel. Big thank you to the Cardano Foundation for organizing this beautiful event. And it's great to be joined here with Massimo as well from Algorand, some thought leaders in the industry. So my very first question is to reflect on the last few weeks we've had in the crypto industry. It's been a turbulent time, to say the least. It's been weeks where we've been watching the collapse of one of the biggest exchanges, FTX, previously valued at $32 billion US dollars. This has shaken up a lot of the industry. We see politicians, regulators, specialists, journalists with their eyeballs popping out watching these events unfold. What are your takeaways? How have you been experiencing these past few weeks? We'll start with you, Massimo.
Thank you very much. I mean, in terms of which blockchains that are still larger than Algorand I prefer, I think that's obvious by looking where I am now, compared to other blockchains that are involved, in the troubles that we've been seeing during the last days. I want to say something that maybe no one has said, I mean, it's easy now to obviously criticize a reality when everything is obvious. But if you look at how things were unfolding even in the past, you realize the difference between different realities, even in the blockchain space. We are all human beings, and even if we want to go to a world in which technology helps us to be better and to work much better as a society, the human being we are is still very relevant. There's a comment that I want to make. In the area of FTX, Alameda, and so on, there was a lot of talking about, I think it was called effective altruism, which means being an entrepreneur or a person that makes a lot of money and then uses this money for doing good. I do understand that in many businesses on reality, this could be a very laudable thing. But I mean, we work in blockchain. So we believe we are doing good in every day of our work. And our main point is making our ethos, our ethics, in everything we do every day, not, in something we will do later, with something that can come out of our work. So for us, changing the world is in the moment we actually work in this sector. That's my view.
And Frederik, do you have anything to add on the impact of the collapse of FTX in the industry?
In a weird way, I think this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Cardano and the people who's building on Cardano, because it truly shows that DeFi was probably a bit more CeFi than what people actually was realizing. It gives the opportunity for DEXs, for people to really explore models which has much more predictability and reliability, and have just the ability to make a proper audit on it. I mean, how beautiful is it that you have a smart contract and you can actually look at the smart contract and actually see what it does, and you can mathematically calculate those things. I mean, I don't understand when you're looking at a centralized exchange and you're saying, this is, connected to DeFi, and you can't even get an access to the balance sheet, and you don't understand the operating model, and you have a lot of smoke and so on out there. So in a strange way, I do think this is a large opportunity for people to really do DeFi, to really start pushing that. On the flip side, it's going to give a lot of work for the Cardano Foundation, because nearly every single regulator in the world is now looking at, do we need to do something urgent? And somebody needs to speak to those regulators and ensure those regulators are not taking the worst or the best of the worst ideas of trying to enforce something down on DAOs, staking, DeFi, NFTs. Because that would be a very, very inhibiting factor for the growth of blockchains who rely on a utility token. So it certainly made the alarm bells go off with every single regulator and most central banks, and that is a problem.
Yes, and I think what you just mentioned, the kind of education and the communication of the crypto industry with the people who are making the rules, is becoming more and more urgent as the industry grows and as events like this take place. I think also you mentioned DeFi and the regulation of DeFi. For example, in the European Union, there's a lot of study happening, very much in a preliminary sense, because of course there's the markets and crypto assets regulation, which is the most comprehensive framework a jurisdiction has come up with to date. But that's focused on centralized exchanges. Now DeFi comes into question. So what do you think? How should DeFi be regulated? What are the most important points, and what are your motives to bring forward to policymakers? Please, Massimo.
Yeah, we're starting exactly from what Frederik was saying, all the story that we have been seeing unfolding in the last 2 weeks, and that's also the reason why, human being ethics was so important, is because it was all related to centralized finance, and a form of centralized finance that we have seen which consequences it has led to, And this has nothing to do with DeFi, and DeFi is a form of activity that is not based on intermediaries, is not based on institution actually taking your possessions, and using them in ways that you don't know, DeFi is essentially based on automating these elements of risk management, which are crucial actually to the functioning of a financial service, and has got one of the main purposes of DeFi is really minimizing credit risk. That was my research when I was still in banking, and I was not surprised to see that then one of the first applications of smart contracts was actually going into this direction in the decentralized world. And this form of financial service, of this form of financial activity, I'm not even sure we should call it financial service because of the importance that everyone has got, in the activity, requires certainly a different kind of regulation from anything we have seen in traditional finance, because almost all regulation actually tell to intermediaries or manager of someone else's asset what they have to do. Here instead, we have a market which is based on rules, on automation, on smart contracts, and that's totally different. That's certainly for me the starting point of any discussion about this.
I see. And what about you, Frederik?
I think we've been doing ourselves a disfavor because we've been trying to name some of the things we're doing based on the technology. So let me give you an example. We've been saying it NFTs. And if you look at the application of NFTs, it's extremely wide. It's from everything from a JPEG picture to an application access to a Veritree and the ability to have, static plus changeable verifiable data based on IoT and drones survey data for reforestation. So when you speak to the policymakers and regulators right now, they're like, okay, we need to regulate NFTs. But I think that's wrong. That's something as a term, as a word we're using about a certain type of technology application. We need to think about the applications. So I would really urge the people out there, even though I know it gives more traction on maybe on Google and other things, to start calling it what it is. So if it is a sports token or a value-adding sports access coin, let's call it that. Let's not just call everything an NFT. Because the problem we're then facing right now is staking. So for instance, in staking, I was just in Singapore speaking to the monetary authorities, the MAS, but also speaking to the UK FSA. And they were really surprised that you can construct a proof of stake mechanism which is as secure as proof of work, but is made in such a way that is positively incentivized and not negatively incentivized. And the difference between that is that if it's negative incentivized, there's an ownership transfer happening as a part of the proof of stake mechanism. And if there is that, we do have a legal term for that, and that is already regulated. And you know what, the regulators, that's why they call it DeFi, right? Because that's what it really is. But when we speak about proof of stake, both in Algorand and Cardano, that's completely different from a regulatory perspective. So I think we really have to be technology specific, and we need to look at the value creation, the value capture layer on the top, and really find words for what it does, not for what the technology enables us to do. And that will help tremendously in terms of the regulators' ideas and, let's say, scope for what is in and out of regulation.
Absolutely. And speaking of, technology and how to avoid politicizing technology when it comes to these negotiations, Massimo, what do you think about how tech and politics merge, and if it's possible to have policies which are tech agnostic?
Well, definitely, decentralized tech actually has got its own fundamental decentralized form of governance and management, I don't know if that's what you meant in your question. So in a sense, decentralized technology is essentially based on the fact that everyone is participating and is deciding and it is contributing based essentially on their commitment to the activity that is decentralized across the community. And essentially every decentralized system needs a sort of proof of commitment, proof of engagement for example, the validation of transaction or for its governance. And that's essentially what proof of stake essentially means, And if you think of what a proof of work originally was, that was probably a good idea in the prehistory of decentralized system, because there was not yet any possibility of having a real digital value that someone could say, this is mine, this shows my commitment, But in a sense, once then, thanks also to the great Bitcoin innovation, there was the possibility to have something that was really of value, managed directly in a decentralized ways on the internet. Then the most natural way of proving your commitment to the system became essentially proof of stake. And that can be the foundation also of the governance, of decentralized activities and of many other aspects of the centralized community. I don't know if that was your answer. For me, this is the politics in a decentralized system, If instead you wanted to know what is the link between, what is now the decentralized technology and blockchain and today politics, for me the most important thing is certainly education, because I still realize that there are so many dramatic misconceptions, for example, about what proof of stake is, that is essentially this kind of proof of commitment, in this sense, not different in the original purpose by proof of work, but thanks to the evolution of technology, eventually efficient and not bad for the environment, And that's a completely different thing, for example, from DeFi, which is what we were talking about before, which can be based, on any kind of decentralized system.
Yes, and looking at this comparison between proof of work, proof of stake. Many people, or there's at least a sect of people, maybe it's Bitcoin supporters or others, that believe that proof of work is the stronger consensus mechanism, it's more secure, it's more decentralized. What, if you had a Twitter argument about this, what is something you would bring up to defend your attachment to proof of stake and what it can do? Frederik, we can start with you.
Oh, so I'm not very good on Twitter. I think most people have
That's
noticed
okay.
this now. I think it's foolish to discuss it because it has two different purposes and it has two different value propositions. So I think it's really about the use case. And I think specifically Cardano has been focusing a lot on that we need to enable the ability for a lot of different use cases, and we need to lower the barrier of entry for that. And the proof is in the math. So the academic research we've done basically proves that the security is at the same level, if not greater, that proof of work, and it allows us to use resources in a different way, which allows us to do much more use cases in a good way. However, I do think that if you have something specifically, if you want to do the next world reserve currency, I find it very, I'm quite happy that Bitcoin has proven that it still not had been hacked and is very stable, and the governance around no changes and the security that there is no changes has a certain appeal to me around that. But I think for enabling identity in Kenya and for replacing the back office of the European Parliament across 30 plus nation states, I think proof of stake, specifically the version which is positively incentivized, which we represent, is definitely the natural evolution and the way to go. And writing that in 160 characters, I need help.
Yes, we're going on to a longer thread at this point, so fair enough. And Frederik, just to continue picking your brain a little bit about this, yesterday we spoke a little bit about how politicians could maybe make more space for blockchain in their policies, how, and this is a bit more future-oriented, but for example, how the travel rule, which is basically supplying KYC, know your customer, information on both sides of a crypto transaction, this is something that's being pushed across several jurisdictions. That's something that blockchain could help with, or what are your insights onto that?
So what people don't really realize is that if you look at the FATF, which basically is setting out the guidelines for anti-money laundering around the world, and there's only like 1 or 2 countries who's not really kind of signing up to that, and there's a large group pressure around that as well. We could solve that within maybe 3 to 4 months of working. And I'm not speaking about making something bespoke. The blockchain does already support it, because we can actually use some of the functionality from NFTs to merge the metadata directly into the transaction. And if we do that, you will basically not only replace thousands of people who's, by the way, very frustrated in their work environment today because they're not working with technology who enables them as humans and where they feel they add value in that process. Plus, we will enable a situation where fraud will go probably to 0 around that specific use case. The question is why we're not doing it. And we're not doing it because everybody has their own little political agenda. And what we're speaking about here is not how do we ensure that anti-money laundering goes to 0. What we're speaking about here is also how do you navigate the right choices by still getting re-elected. And that's tough because everybody has their own version of how you be re-elected and their own value proposition in the national states and so on. So from a technology perspective, the 3rd generation blockchains, we've solved it. It's not a question, it's done. The question is, why are they not implementing it? And it's not a question of regulation, because we know for a fact, we saw that with the Singapore monetary authorities who just allowed a transaction using a public permissionless blockchain and accepted finality on that among 2 different sovereign states. So we know we can do it. The question is just, why aren't we doing it? And a lot of that is going back to education. So the people who are sitting and looking at that is isolated, looking at very few use cases, which is related to some kind of DeFi and some kind of crypto tokenomics. And that's just not enough. We need to start screaming about what other things you can do on a blockchain and not stopping the revolution of cryptocurrencies. We cannot stop that. That has to keep going on, but we need to start a new track, which is about enlightening people, educating people, and encouraging people to find value in a decentralized database, and how identity can be merged into that, and how governance can play a new role in that, and leveling the playing field among small states and large states, among small companies and large companies, among companies who don't necessarily have the money to go on site in foreign countries and do their due diligence. All of that is enabling economic growth. And you know what? That's what everybody's screaming for right now. Everybody wants job creation, economic growth, accountability, and more transparency. So I truly think that our value proposition is speaking directly to the politicians, but we need to change the narrative, and we need to help them to understand these things.
Massimo, is there anything you wanted to immediately add on to that?
We are probably still talking, in my opinion, about education. It's
Yes.
absolutely true that the blockchain can do totally amazing things. And for example, now we talk a lot about Web3. I don't really see the difference between Web3 and blockchain technology, because in a sense, for me, blockchain technology was the need to add a layer on top of the internet to allow a few things, to allow an actual timestamp of everything that happens to the internet, and that's what consensus algorithms do, and proof of stake does it in a way which is efficient and environmentally good. And then we needed definitely, essentially, to break a little bit the client-server, mechanics by which, as you may have noticed in the internet, if someone is successful in a business, you risk ending up with one single big provider in the whole world, That's why we went to peer-to-peer. And definitely, the other thing that is amazing in the internet today is that any form of useful identity, digital identity, is missing. It's ridiculous what we do every time we need to interact, with a service in the internet, that every time we have to reinvent our, nickname and tell the counterparty a password, The blockchain has used, cryptography in actually to create the possibility of a stable identity. And now, starting from this technology, this can become a relevant identity, and that can be recognized, also from the institution, that we have now this technological possibility of having your identity also in a digital form, And then I do agree that it's very important, that politicians or institutions understand, for example, what are the actual common elements of different technologies, For example, understanding that, between proof of work or proof of stake, and also different form of proof of stake, the fundamental purpose is the one of having a proof of your commitment, your engagement, your participation to an economic activity, and that needs to be the foundation of your possibility to validate or to govern. Then with proof of stake, in a sense, let's start from proof of work, because it came first, that was a sort of beginning of this history, and I would say that we should recognize that while being an actually valid way of proving your commitment, it had to use an economic commitment visible outside the digital space, with people having to spend money on a big hardware, consuming energy, because there was not yet any possibility to look at value in the digital space, while proof of stake is exactly the technological evolution, and it has got two fundamental advantages. The environment friendliness, which needs, in my opinion, to be recognized, by politicians, and secondly, the efficiency, the capacity of, in a sense, making transactions with an effectiveness and an efficiency that make it also a potential solutions to many problems of the traditional financial world. But it still goes through, communication and speaking a lot, with politicians, regulators, also with the TradFi, so that real understanding gets through.
Absolutely. So there's a few things, very interesting things that you mentioned here, but Let me start maybe with the identities. Having spoken to both of you a little bit beforehand, I picked up on how much proof of stake, what kind of options it gives to different layers of identities. You mentioned the shift in paradigm in our online identity using blockchain. What are different kinds of layers of identity that blockchain or proof of stake specifically can offer? And maybe Frederik, if we can start with you.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is one of those questions where there is the perception and there is reality. The perception is every time we speak about identity, what we really mean is a centralized authority issuing a national travel ID or passport, and that can then be augmented with a couple of salary slips, and that's about it. And if that is the discussion we're having, we completely failed the point. Because what we've seen again and again using AI, machine learning, blockchain, and so on, is that every single use case have a different need for a type of identity. So identity is more like a gradient, where in a certain way we start with the idea of public and private addresses, right? Which is a very simple type of identifier who connects you or might connect you to a person, and all the way up to, let's call it Facebook metaverse kind of thing, where they know so much about you that they're even scared to do the algorithm and actually extract that because they know it's against more or less all data privacy rules there is in the world. And then when we go outside the scale of these identities, because there's a really big difference between what you need for a supply chain, so what we did with the country of Georgia for the agricultural production to ensure that you can actually have entities who's adding the correct entities who's adding the data to the blockchain, right? To revealing everything there is about yourself, including zero knowledge proof, and then into what we think about more as self-sovereign identities, because that's then the next question. Should we as humans be allowed to own, control, and manage our life and the data footprint our life has? And I stand in the camp that I think we are growing up to do that ourselves. And it's not just something we should be asking for, it's something we should be demanding. But to be able to do that, we also need to take more responsibility. Because if you lose that identity or lose control of that identity, you very quickly get to a centralized authority, and where you're starting to ask, oh, dear government or dear identity authority, can you regain my access, or what can you do? And that gives this big question about, how much responsibility can we actually put on the human when we go to a real self-sovereign identity? And I think with the evolution of robotics and automatization, I think we will have mental capacity to start thinking and taking responsibility of our own data footprint. So I think we can certainly do that. But this is a big thing, and I'm really excited to know that there's a lot of DID projects, digital identity projects represented, not just here in Lausanne today, but also in the Cardano summits around the world. And I'm looking forward to that Cardano will have multiple types of identity on both axes in the future.
I see. And Massimo, do you think that society is ready to take ownership of identity at this level?
Well, in a sense, I think that, again, we need to understand what technology is offering now, So technology presents us with problems and gives us solutions, At times the problems come before the solution, which is normal in a sense. And, if you think of what our identity means, and forget for a second, the digital world, our identity means, first of all, who we are, what we can do, and our mental and physical existence and our will and so on. And then, obviously, there are other aspects of identity. There is an identity of myself as the chief economist of Algorand that needs, in a sense, to be proven by Algorand Foundation. There is an identity of myself as an Italian citizen needs to be proven by the Italian government. In the old world, in the non-digital world, that's the situation. We have to understand that thanks to cryptography, in the digital world, now we do have the possibility of being the owners of our identity. I mean, many people say, oh, I would like to have a digital signature, so I'm going to ask this authority. Wait, having a digital signature is something that you can do on your own, and you can be the owner. Then obviously there are some cases in which this digital identity needs to be communicated, and there are information that needs to come from other players that they will have their digital identity and need to conform what your digital identity is. And then obviously there are issues with identity in the traditional world, which are different, from issues about managing keys that you may have in the digital space. But I also believe with Frederik that, again, now the digital identity was a solution to the problem of an internet without identity. Then it creates the problem of managing your keys and the risk of losing. And technology is providing a solution to that as well.
All right. And maybe if we can look back, we've had another big event this year in the crypto ecosystems, and that's the merge, the transition of Ethereum mainnet to proof of stake from proof of work. What kind of impact did this have on the industry? And we can also touch about politics, but we can also touch about maybe interoperability or governance. What does it mean for you? Frederik, how about we start with you?
So first of most, it verified that proof of stake is the right consensus algorithm. We can then discuss various implications and applications of proof of stake, but I think the recognition that the proof of stake is more scalable and offers you more at a lower utility, I think that's very possible. Right? It verifies Cardano's stance on a proof of stake blockchain. The thing that concerns me the most is that this is, to a certain extent, the largest smart contracting platform in the world, and the platform where most people had an idea about what it was and what it wasn't. And by moving that to proof of stake, you change the whole incentive model, plus you change the whole monetary model around it, which actually is creating a regulatory event. Now, whether or not the community is recognizing that, or whether or not that's going to mean something, what it certainly does is it raises a lot of questions, which nobody seems to be ready to answer. And I think that's a huge concern. So, I think if blockchain should be something, it should be transparent and certain. You should be able to have certainty about what it does and what it doesn't. So this kind of new ideas that a centralized organization says, with the future update, we will release your stake, is very hard to explain to, traditional institutions, compliance departments, and politicians and policymakers around the world, to be honest.
You mentioned incentive models. What do you mean with that? Could you expand on what you mean there?
Yeah, well, it's coming back to my point about we need to be technology specific. So we were kind of celebrating that we are moving to a proof of stake model, but it's definitely not the proof of stake model of Cardano, right? So it on the surface is very good for environment. It's for environmental sustainability. This is an excellent news, but it also shows to a certain extent a key, a part of centralization which the institutions was not aware that was there, and the way they kind of incentivize security on the model is it puts us in an awkward situation where we always took the stand that we will work together with all blockchains and we will have a common front to show the world how blockchain should work. And now we need to really go down into the engine room and actually describe the differences between Cardano and Ethereum. And that was never the position we wanted to be in. We wanted to speak about bridges, interoperability, and use the education and the adoption they had to a positive advancement of Cardano. So it kind of puts us in a bit of an awkward position, to be honest, in terms of ensuring that the world goes to a more public and permissionless environment.
Okay.
I think that there is a point that I want to talk about this, and it is the fact that, as I said before, that when you look at DeFi, there cannot be a regulation which is based, you know, on saying to people that are supposed to manage, you know, someone else's asset, you have to do this, you have to do that, because that people are not managing someone else's asset in DeFi, you know. But in a sense, and so you need to look a little bit into what the technology does, you know, rather than only think of what was the system outside, you know, the decentralized world. But a little bit disregards the old blockchain space, you know. The concept that you could regulate or making policies without looking into the technology, I don't know how it is sustainable in a world with blockchain, or even in a world up to a point with artificial intelligence, you know. And this is true, you know. So, well, first of all, I mean, about Ethereum, I mean, I'm going to be very brief, you know. It's obvious that Ethereum wanted to take that logical evolution in, you know, proving commitment of people. Now, they have a lot of applications, that DeFi, but many other things that's super good, you know, and they wanted to reduce their footprint, you know, in a dramatic way, because there's no comparison, you know, from what Ethereum was essentially consuming in terms of carbon footprint in the past and what they do now. And still, you know, for example, the carbon footprint of Algorand is much smaller again, you know. And okay, that was quite obvious, but even more obvious was that they obviously wanted to reduce, in a sense, the risk of forks. They want to increase the scalability. You know, that was the starting point of Algorand. So they are going into logical direction. But it's also true what Frederik is doing. You know, up to a point, you have to look a little bit into the details of what the different consensus algorithm has. Because in general, you know, proof of stake and proof of work, they are not fundamentally different in what they want to achieve, apart from the fact that one is inefficient and consumes a lot of energy and is polluting, and the other one is not. But then, when you look at the specifics of actually a consensus algorithm, there are differences, and at some point one needs to look into these differences, you know, if they want to express a view on blockchain technology.
So, on the political front, we've seen a great celebration of the merge because of this environmental factor. I think ESG compliance at different levels around the world have increased due to this, you know, huge difference in energy consumption on one of the biggest, you know, nets and protocols in the crypto ecosystem. Have you seen this shift in conversations with regulators that you've had following the merge, and kind of the importance that they put on environmental factors?
I mean, certainly that with regulators, but also with TradFi, the carbon footprint of proof of work was a real issue, you know, for the blockchain conversation at the very beginning. You know, I believe that now they are getting to understanding that blockchain does not need to have this kind of carbon footprint. And I do think that it can make sense, you know. I mean, I'm not supporting, you know, the idea. I mean, Bitcoin was super important, and you know, it has got a role, you know, that is obvious to everyone in the space. Also, part of his role was that of being, you know, in a sense, frozen as it was at the beginning, and that's part of its value proposition. On the other hand, I do believe that makes sense that regulators distinguish, you know, and consider the carbon footprint, you know. But we also have to remember that nowadays, most of the other businesses, you know, have a carbon footprint that must be much bigger. Let's not even talk about the carbon footprint of TradFi, you know. So obviously it's not that blockchain technology can be the only activity in today's world which is asked to be totally, you know, using no energy or having no carbon footprint. And obviously we are all committed, we are particularly committed, you know, in being net zero, but this is an effort that needs to be asked to the whole economy, actually.
Yes, and I think you know, now the EU is also coming out with a grading system for different cryptos, so you'll be able to see, if this comes into effect, how energy efficient a certain crypto is on the exchange itself. But of course, I completely agree that blockchain has the benefit that you can have a lot of transparency. You can see how much energy is really happening, while with TradFi, that's a lot more opaque. Yes, Frederik, I don't know if you had anything to add on the environmental front and your vision for that, especially in proof of stake.
I think it's a difficult discussion, because in a certain way, the move also lets Bitcoin stand a bit alone. And it takes a lot more scrutiny right now. And what we really should do is we should say, how marvelous is it really that we have something who replicates the financial system, who replicates money, and we actually know down more or less to the last dime what the environmental footprint is of that, not just from an electricity perspective, but also from a e-waste perspective. And then we should turn around and we should look at the systems we use every single day to operate society and say, why is it that we don't know anything about that? Why don't we know anything about, the inefficiencies of those systems and what that footprint really is? So instead of we are looking at the one who actually is very transparent and showing to the world what it means, and then we're going after that, when we should be looking, at all the other systems. And we have a stake pool operator here in Lausanne today who actually brought his stake pool. So you can see it outside, and there's a watt meter connected to that. So I think it really also makes it a little bit more transparent what Cardano is and isn't in terms of that. But to be honest, I think we need to start taking the fight to the regulators and taking the fight to the nation states and demand transparency of our daily life and our daily interactions with what we think about as common infrastructure of society, instead of letting them narrow in on the one thing who actually is transparent and the one, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think the crowd agrees here. And I think it's also interesting that you mentioned an e-waste perspective, because people are very, stuck on the energy footprint of proof of work, but actually there's a lot more to it, and it's very, I think, right to broaden that, to reflect on the other systems we use every day. And maybe to bring back to Web3 and kind of have a more open question as we slowly start wrapping up. What is your vision for Web3, the next maybe 1, 5, 10 years? Where are we heading? Maybe Massimo, we can start with you.
I mean, obviously, we have started by providing a way on the internet to actually have a recognition of your own, of what is your own. We are starting, with the recognition of, with having a sort of stable identity, which is based on cryptography. And then definitely, obviously, technology needs to evolve, to allow this, for example, to extend, to social networks. It's more complicated, Some things are easier with smart contract already, and some things, you see a lot of innovation on Algorand or also on Cardano, actually, in order to solutions that allow you to do more, but in this direction. And the same regards, bringing this possibility also in those activities that have a digital part and a physical part, And this is also where the technology needs to evolve, to go beyond, those businesses that we can see now that are still either purely digital. I mean, for example, the metaverse. The metaverse is going to be a great thing, but the full experience, the full service is evolving, and will continue to evolve, and we need to commit to this evolvement.
Yes, and I think the metaverse is something that's very much in its infancy. We're going to have to see how that goes into the future, and also how politicians or regulators are going to interact with that. Do you have any maybe tips for regulators as the metaverse becomes more prominent?
I think it's a tip for everybody, not just the regulator. I think it's quite simple. I mean, if Web3 should make any sense at all, it has to be decentralized, and we have to change the operating models and the incentive mechanisms, which we see in Web2 today, so that doesn't happen again. It has to be for the people, by the people, and that you have to be able to own and control your own footprint. And if that doesn't happen, then it's just a better user experience of Web2.
I think you're going to have to speak with Meta and Zuckerberg about that. And is there any maybe final takeaway message that you want to give on to the rest of the conference and the people watching when it comes to proof of stake and your organizations and what you're doing?
Well, personally, I think that I'm very happy to be here, you know, at a community that in the end, for me, is the same community, you know, is the community of that want to change the world with decentralized technology, is the community that want to continue improving this incredible revolution of blockchain. And so I'm thanking Frederik for inviting me and all of you to be here together with us. Thank you.
And what about you, Frederik? Any closing words?
No, I think my cry out for action is simply build, deploy, ship, and show the world what you can do on a blockchain. By doing that, you help the rest of us by turning regulation, policymakers, and creating clarity around education. So do what you do best now. It is time to build, deploy, and use that technology.
A big thank you to everyone. Thank you, Frederik. Thank you, Massimo, for sharing your insights today, and looking forward to the rest of the conference.